this is GM Jesse Kraai, and it's my pleasure to bring you a new series on the famous Tal Botvinnik match of 1960. This match, I think, is very important in chess history, not only as a beautiful match, but a match in which something new was brought to the chess world, which has lasted with us all this time. However, I think it's important to look back on this match and reflect on what the contribution really was, because it's actually a very complicated thing that happened in the chess world, and it's really still debated. In short, what was Tal's contribution to the game? What new elements, new dimensions did he bring? And some people to this day, there's an argument that he was a little lucky with his tricks, and some people think he was actually onto something deeper. And I hope that this match will show that he actually was onto something deeper, and we're going to try to articulate that as we go through the games. In Game 1 in particular, we give us a platform from which to talk about what Tal brought to the game. And Game 1 is a fantastic struggle, even though it only lasts 25 moves, which really showcases what goes right when things go right for Tal. Okay, so let's take a look. This is Game 1, 1960, 50 years ago, Tal Botvinnik. So Game 1, Botvinnik uses the winnower, and E5, of course. We're going to see that Tal is really going to choose the most aggressive options in the opening whenever he has a chance. C5, A3, bishop takes, pawn takes. And one of the interesting things about this match, about Tal always choosing the most aggressive lines, is that that's not only in Tal's style, but really it was a little bit uncomfortable for Botvinnik to play against Tal using this style where he's always trying for complications. And we're going to talk more about that as the match goes on. Now, knight e7 is maybe the main line here, but totally acceptable is what Botvinnik plays here, queen c7. And this move is still sometimes seen today. Ibragimov and other GMs play this move, queen c7. Now, the idea is obviously to put pressure onto the c3 pawn, but less obvious is to guard this g7 pawn. And how does that happen? That happens after queen g4, f5. Now, it should be said, knight f3 is a very good move here. And Tal says something interesting. He says, after knight f3, the game would be sufficiently complicated, but insufficiently sharp. And we're going to see that that's why a lot of these games are so exciting, is that Tal always is going in for the sharpest lines. So queen g4, f5, and here queen g3. Sometimes today, grandmasters do a little dance where they try to get this g6 in, which they think of as a weakness, and then go all the way home. But what Tal played is still played today. And we're going to see there's some really big complications associated with this move. So Tal here plays the most ambitious move, knight e7, which is allowing white to take on g7, which Tal immediately does. Queen g7, rook g8, queen h7, and now pawn takes pawn. And here we have a first critical position. And now this is just a complete mess, typical of the winnower. White doesn't have any of the pieces out. But as in a lot of these winnower positions, it's important to see that even though white's pieces aren't out, the position is fairly fluid, and the bishops really are already active on their home posts. And that's a key thing about the winnower. Now, in order to understand this next move, which is one of the strangest, we're going to have to look first at the natural move. Natural move would be here, knight e2, and we see this in analogous other winnower lines. But the problem, I don't think there's actually a huge problem with this move, but the issue is first you just block the bishop, but also after knight c6, you're still not really threatening to take on d4. So, for example, if you protect your pawn on e5, black can say, okay, bishop b7, I keep developing. The point is, if you ever take, black can take on d4, and due to this queen c3 problem, you can't take on d4 with the knight. So that's what white's trying to avoid when he makes this next move, which should strike you as insane, even though this move was in fact played before by Gligorich against Petrosian, I think in the same, I think maybe 59. So king d1 is the move. Okay, now before I get it too much into king d1, let me just show you the game with Gligorich and Petrosian. You can see the idea with king d1. First of all, you're getting off this square being mine, so you're getting off that a5 e1 diagonal. So let's look at that game. Knight c6, knight f3. So notice we get a much more fluid development this way by being able to put our knight on f3. And the tactical justification is on knight e5, we have bishop g5 exclam. And black really is in a horrible mess, because if knight f3, bishop b5 check is actually the end of the game. Notice how fast the bishops came out there. And one thing I just actually noticed in this recording just now is that this move bishop g5, which we see in this Gligorich-Petrosian game, is going to come in a powerful way in the actual game itself. So this idea probably was already in Tal's mind here of something he wanted to do. Okay, so that's the notion. But obviously king d1 is a highly suspect move. There's just no way it can be completely clean. And Botvinnik comes up with a very solid response here. Bishop d7. And Tal was unprepared for this. The notion is that on knight f3, black has bishop a4. And it's very messy. For example, bishop b3, queen c3, and we have a complete mess because a1 is threatened and d3. So that's the idea behind bishop d7, to create those threats, and that gives white a lot of grief. And now some very interesting stuff happens. Imagine, you've been preparing for this match, and Botvinnik finds this move bishop d7. It has some very potent ideas, and you're not really prepared for it. And so, first thing Tal does is he gives the check, which is, I think, the right move, and knight g6. Now, you're in this situation, and most GMs would play queen h7 here, force a draw. What do you want to do? Because if king d8, if nothing else, repeat. Because if king d8, then bishop g5, and it may at least have an unpleasant pin that black has to think about. But very scary to play on in this position when you don't have to. And that's precisely what Tal does. Tal now plays knight e2. Now, we're going to have to start talking about the aesthetics of this game, but the first thing that's very interesting is that we played king d1, so we wouldn't have to play knight e2. And on the next move, we're playing knight e2 anyway. It's important to see that there are some differences. For one, we are threatening to simply take this pawn now because, for example, knight c6, if pawn takes pawn, then there's no knight d4, as we saw in those other variations. Okay, so let's go back a second. Knight e2, and black plays a very interesting move. I think it should be the right move. Feels right. d3. By the way, I just want to say something for this match. I have not used the computer in my analysis, and I'm sure I would have discovered more mistakes and problems with the games, but I really wanted to get a chess sense of what was happening, and I knew that I wouldn't be able to get that if I used the computer, which would tell me that both players had made many mistakes. which is natural. And so, a lot of my judgments in this position will just have to do with general chess knowledge and not so much with, computer banging out variations. So d3, pawn takes. And now a very interesting remark on the position of how Tal sees the position here. Now, what to do for black? Let's look briefly at what Tal says. He says, black should not give the check on a4 because that helps the king go back to where it wants to go. Okay, so this is already really kind of funny in a way because we've moved to d1 and now with the change in the pawn structure, really we want to move to e1 anyway. And the bishop on a4 we'll see is a little bit problematically placed. But first to understand this, let's look at what his suggestion is. First developing knight c6 and now f4. Now notice, if you play d4, then all of these squares become really vulnerable with things like knight a5 after castles. So Tal says f4, castles, and here he doesn't give a lot of analysis and simply says this is a real mess for white because black will eventually simply take on e5. And I studied this position quite a bit. And it's really fascinating because that statement is an intuitive statement because there's no way to actually calculate this out. Because for one, in this particular position, white can do all kinds of different moves. And what I'm going to look at is simply king e1, just as an example, because Tal says that the king really belongs there anyway. And I think to a certain extent it's right. Now because after this pawn takes here, we want to get the king off of this diagonal. But as you can imagine, there's many other moves here for white than king e1. So, I'm just going to show a sample variation here. d4. And again, black doesn't have to play c4. It just seems logical for him to play c4 to try to keep things close. c4, and now very interesting, is knight takes pawn, pawn takes, knight takes. Now notice, we really, we're not even up in the material. We didn't even gain a pawn for that because we were already 2 pawns behind. But white does have a lot of grief here. The pawn on d3 is attacked, and notice you can't really defend it with a move like queen h3 because rook h8 will drive the queen away from d3, and if we win d3, of course, we're very beautiful. This is definitely a mess, and one thing I was really afraid of for a while was knight d4. Excuse me. Queen's on h5, knight takes e5, and now knight d4. Because on bishop e8, somehow this is working out for white. However, it seemed to me, trying to make this work, that knight g4 gives black very good attacking prospects. And one of the things that Tal realized, I think, when he made his intuitive judgment about saying white will eventually take on e5, is that the king on e1 is just permanently a problem. He's not going to get immediately mated, but there's going to be some long-term issues for the guy. And right now we have things like queen e5 as a problem. Bishop e8 is still a question for black, for white, and rook h8 is coming. So, for example, knight f3, bishop c6, all of white stuff is activated, and it's really hard to prevent big counterplay now from black. So in this position, you can say it's not over for white, but clearly there's some big problems. And one of the things that's really nice about Tal's game is that he's willing to make these sacrifices without too much wrangling, inner wrangling, which a lot of players, including myself, have when we sacrifice some pieces, because it can be very frightening, and he's a lot more willing to do it. But you can imagine that Botvinnik probably wasn't so willing to do such a thing. That he probably saw this move f4 and didn't see a concrete way through, and that's what leads Botvinnik to play what happens in the game, which turns out to be very problematic. So let's look at that. Bishop a4, king e1. Now, black can still get a position similar to what we just saw with knight c6 and f4. But obviously it's a little bit better for white here because this king is actually more safe and has some more options. So, instead, bishop a4, king e1, Botvinnik steals a pawn. Well, gets his pawn back. You can imagine him thinking, well, this is okay for me. I've got this pawn, and I don't feel too bad about life. Well, the problem is that now bishop g5 is enormously strong. Because this bishop, we're going to see, really cuts the black king, and that cuts the position for black suddenly in two. And because black now can't castle, his king has just as many problems now as the white king. So all of a sudden, after bishop g5, Botvinnik probably realized that things were now not going to be so easy at all. Probably when he played queen e5, he was quite confident in the position. Now, I don't think black's necessarily lost, but we're going to see that he has some serious problems with this king not being able to move. The other thing, just to point out aesthetically, is bishop g5, as in the Gligorich game, is the unopposed bishop. That's the bishop that doesn't have a rival. And that's the bishop, when you have the two bishops, it's really going to be powerful in an open position like this. So bishop g5, all of white's other pieces really aren't doing anything yet. And now black is cut. So, knight c6, and now d4. So, one of the problems here for black is that the queen e4 really isn't doing too much, because we can always shove her away with moves like f3. So black plays queen c7, natural move, and now another very nice move from white, h4. So let's take a look. h4 is really a dual purpose move, three purposes, let's call it. Okay, let's start with the least important first. We're getting closer to be a passed pawn, or it is a passed pawn, we're getting closer to the edge of the board. 2, we're supporting the bishop, and by supporting the bishop, we're blunting this rook's activity on the g-file. But most importantly, we're enabling this rook to come into the game via rook h3. And, obviously this is the way amateurs, move their rooks into the game, and we're going to see both of Tal's rooks come into the game in a very funny way here. And I think for Tal, that's a great creative achievement to be able to play a world championship match in this very funny way. So black's problem is very hard to do anything right now. And one of the things that's interesting is that I think with h4, Tal also senses that black is going to have to try to do something active in the center himself with e5. And that's going to enable the white rook playing via rook h3 and rook e3. And that's precisely what happens. Queen f7, rook h3, e5, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, and now rook e3. So first, a little tactic here. If rook h8, then we have rook e5. Now, one of the funny things about this game is that black is going to be really trying for quite some time here to get rid of the queen. Okay? And we're going to see that there's a funny aesthetic moment here later that black is always trying to get rid of the queen, and then we'll see how white deals with that at the end. Okay, so black would like to threaten rook h8 and plays king d7. So again, we don't respond to the threat directly, but now activate our other rook with rook b1. Okay, so here Botvinnik makes a mistake, but it's not so easy, at least at first, to see why it's a mistake. And it's also very understandable why he did it. The best move here would be bishop c6. But why wouldn't you want to play bishop c6? Well, one of the reasons is we would like to believe that the bishop is doing something on a4. That was part of the whole previous plan, that we got to put our bishop on that nice looking square, which in a lot of French positions is quite lovely to have your bishop looking into the white position. But we're going to see there's problems associated with that. But let's look at the variation Tal gives, because I think it's fairly instructive. And that is knight d4, and now black's best is probably f4. And here, very simple variation that Tal gives in the book. Rook e5, knight e5, queen f7, knight f7, bishop f4. But you can imagine if you're Botvinnik, you want no part of this if you had seen this. Because these three passed pawns are very strong, and the white minors are also at the same time very active. So whether this position's technically lost or not, I won't say at the moment, but it's clearly very unpleasant for black. So, in the game, Botvinnik plays the more ambitious b6. And one of the problems with a couple problems with b6. You're weakening these squares on the queen side. In particular, we can imagine maybe a queen coming to a6 someday, and then threatening both the bishop and the b7 square. Also, the bishop on a4 is a problem all into itself. And we're going to see that in the game as well. That we can use that bishop as a tempo. So now, knight f4, rook he8, and now very nice rook b4. It's a very nice move in that the rook, both rooks now have activated themselves from the side, going laterally now to the action in the center. Black moves his bishop, and now a very nice move from an aesthetic point of view. White plays queen d1. Now let's think about this for a moment. The white king went to d1. He went back. The queen also went out and went back now to her original position. All of white's rooks, both of white's rooks, got into the game in very unconventional ways. And the bishop on f1 hasn't even moved yet. So we have really an aesthetic beauty in this position, to the extent that we've done something so out of the ordinary here and reached a position that, if not winning, is very unpleasant now for black. And really, black's king, when we look at it, is far more in danger than white's king. So there's really it's really difficult for black to do anything concretely now. Notice if you play knight g4, white could take on e8 and play bishop e2, or even a move like rook e2. And black's problems will persist here. So in the game, Botvinnik played knight f4, rook f4, knight g6, and now the very simple rook b4. And black took, but notice this move, pawn takes. Very simple, nice move. We don't move the bishop away from g5. It continues to do all the things that it was doing before. And black has a very simple problem now with c4 coming. And that's in fact what happens. King e7, c4. And black's completely lost. And black, we'll see, falls apart here very quickly. But one of the things we'll just notice that's part of the match in general is that Botvinnik has a problem with the clock. There's a problem with taking too much time, trying to find the absolutely best moves. And this allows Tal, when we get into some kind of messy chaos towards the end of time control, moving up to move 40, this allows Tal a lot of tactical chances. And one thing just interesting historically to note, back then you had 2.5 hours for your first 40 moves, so a lot more time than you have today. And you can imagine that Botvinnik would have far less chances in this match if we played it with a modern time control, simply because the modern time control is so much faster. In the game, Botvinnik fell apart, but it's unclear what he really should do with pawn takes. And what's nice about this is it really enables the bishop, which wasn't developed on f1, to come into the game and finish black. Bishop c4, queen g7, bishop takes, queen takes, h5. So a beautiful game from an aesthetic point of view, in the sense that you're able to play at the World Championship level this kind of chess, which is very abstract and has a lot of unconventional ideas in it. Now, one thing I want to point out that's an really fascinating thing, which will help us maybe understand Tal a little bit better, is that, let's go back just briefly to move 11. This is move 11 is king d1, which in fact, as I had said, had been played by Gligovic before. With king d1, however, one thing that is fascinating here is he gives this move a question mark. Okay, and he goes on to say in his remarks, you know, people cringe at this kind of move, chess commentators. And then it's a very funny thing. Then he gives his rationale for the move, all the things that we saw in the game, in particular, keeping this knight uncommitted between these two squares. And one of the funny things about a question mark there is it's unclear whether he meant it really as a joke. And one of the funny things about this joke, okay, to see the humor of this joke, is that it's not clear that Tal believed, I think, in correct moves and incorrect moves in the same way a lot of other chess players do. Other chess players will want to talk about some kind of objective truth about chess. And there we can really talk about exclamation marks, question marks, all these other funny things that we think about when we think about an objective view of the game, which I don't think Tal really had. And we're going to see that in this match, is that really, for Tal, it's far less about in some kind of pursuance of objective truth, and more about trying to win the game. Winning the game with setting your opponent's problems that he will be uncomfortable in dealing with. And so this king d1 question mark is a very funny thing, because in a way it's as if he's making fun of people who do view chess in this scholastic way of truth and falsity. So I'm very much enjoying bringing you this series. I myself have gotten a lot out of studying these games, and it's 50 years on, and I think a very healthy time to take a look back and talk about Tal's contribution, which we'll continue to do throughout this series. So, till game 2, this is GM Jesse Kraai. Bye-bye.